What I thought I'd do is to take the three questions that are at the end of the first page of the workshop. It says something like, and so from this workshop, our objectives are to answer the following questions. The first question is something like, so basically, have we done what it says on the exam paper? So the first question is, what are the drivers and consequences of, or roughly, I'm paraphrasing here, what are the drivers and consequences of innovation in diagnostic technologies? And I think, in terms of test, you just think of the term tests and distinguish that from diagnosis. It's quite clear there are a number of things we've heard about today. The search for biomarkers is a good example of tests as biomarkers. And the drivers of those biomarker tests are likely to be a number of things. First of all, speed of delivery and the utility of new tests compared with existing ones. That's going to drive the adoption and design of tests. Improvement in sensitivity and specificity of tests to reduce errors, to clarify and confirm what biological processes might be behind a particular syndrome. That would be the second one. Another driver for such tests would be data-driven approaches, or data-driven drivers, I suppose. So, for example, the globalized endeavour to standardise diagnostic evidence, both commercial and public health interests behind that. And you see here a form of a collective biomarker, if you like. For example, the use of patient e-records, currently in the NHS, the MRC and the NHS, Department of Health are getting together to do that. You can see those e-records as a form of collective biomarker. And so images and records, and Michael picked up on images and records in e-patient records, are of increasing importance of this. They are, if you like, visual and written biomarkers within that particular database, data-driven approach. So those, I think, are some of the drivers behind the emergence of attributable value in different types of tests. Second question was, these again are all points that people have made. So I'm not actually mentioning individuals in this, just picking up the themes that I heard. Second question was, are the predictive diagnostic and therapeutic technologies interrelated? Well, yes, they are, from what we've heard today. Saw that classically in, I'm just going to go back on what I just said, in Katie's story about the Rett's syndrome, very nice story there, where it's quite apparent that the predictive test produces a diagnostic spectrum, which then leads to different models of the syndrome, and so different treatment regimes and resources devoted to those, including those mobilised by patients and their families, resources within the patients and their families. So they're very strongly related, to answer that question in different sorts of ways. The other question is, how might sociology, again I'm paraphrasing here, speak to the world of health technology assessment, HTA? And of course Chris was talking about that much earlier on. And I think what we see from the discussion here is that appraisal and assessment, which is what the HTA does, is as much about making decisions under conditions of ignorance as it is under conditions of robust knowledge. So the thing here is to have regimes of appraisal and accountability that recognise this, making decisions in conditions of some ignorance. So while NICE, for example, must have, through HTA procedures, it must seek through those procedures as much clarity as possible, that's its job, it need not mean regulatory refusal when information is highly provisional, which is one of the themes we've heard today. But perhaps, in those contexts, new forms of monitoring. So it may be a role here for new sites of appraisal, new means of appraisal, and evidence that are sensitive to interpretive and contextual forms of knowledge and experience, because that's where the provisionality arises, including, perhaps, self-diagnosis via social media and the internet, as Sally, I think, has so clearly suggested in her presentation. So those are sort of brief answers to those three questions. And then just finally, a couple of sort of three cross-cutting themes, if I may, that came out apart from answering those questions. So these are sort of themes that I saw appear. One theme, strong theme, was pathways, using that word in a number of ways. Different senses of movements, different senses of journey. So we had notions about the algorithms of competing diagnosis, think about algorithms of pathway, that act as a selection and switching device and moves patients down different trajectories. That's one sense of pathway. The second sense of pathway we heard today in different ways was the idea of resource and investment pathways associated with that, particularly, for example, in the context of industrial production, as Paul was saying in his intervention right at the beginning of the day. The other pathway might be, Sally sort of picked up on it, was the perhaps use by the analysts of the internet to map how diagnostic tools emerge over time, so sort of mapping the pathway of the tools themselves. And there is, I think, in terms of commercial pathways, there's a lot of interest in the crucial issue about how tests and related devices are classified for and by regulators, for by the company and by regulators. And that will determine sort of pathway that those tests, devices and tools will go down, and then how they impact upon interventions with patients. So pathways is an interesting thing. The second thing was context, stress on the variability by context or of tests and diagnoses, attention particularly between localization of meaning and the use of tests and monitoring devices, and a desire to standardize and globalize diagnostics by, for example, standards agencies and companies who need to scale up technologies for markets. So that tension between the local and global came out. Second notion of context, tests as performative and workable in different settings, so the performativity of tests, time and space factors shape on that process, and particularly the times and spaces of clinical, familial and organisational contexts have different rhythms to them, and therefore the sense, as Michael said in one of his comments, of what's appropriate varies by these different settings. And the other contextual theme I thought was translational medicine, and it came out time and again. I think that translational medicine is best seen as a pragmatic issue rather than some sort of linear notion of best practice, but a pragmatic issue for reaching practical outcomes. And maybe one could extend this to lay diagnosis, as Nicky was suggesting at the end, as a translational process itself. And then the final thing was lay understanding, which is sort of part of it. That has to be understood in a variety of contexts: acute versus chronic, singular versus multiple disorder, inheritable diseases, last comments, and how they're understood. So we need to look in terms of lay understanding, I think, at the social life, if you like, of diagnoses and diagnostic categories by individual and patient groups, and the way diagnostic identities might be mobilised in positive ways, not only framed in negative terms. Again, we keep suggesting that towards the end. And then the final thing, quite important, is so what? So what? I think what we've heard today, particularly from, and I don't know, apologies to other colleagues if you're in these domains too, but from Paul and from Chris Hyde, who are not sociologists, but are working in contexts where these tests are used or developed. It's quite clear, I think, that there are sites of engagement which would welcome social science, Paul's already said this, over coffee, to help understanding the complexities of these processes. And so I think there are genuine efforts that one can make in pushing an open door in this sense to engage with those involved in both the production, design and use and clinical intervention, if you like, use of these tests and devices. So we're pushing an open door there, and we should try as much as we can to do that. The second thing I think, so what? I think we could compare models of uncertainty and risk as found in formal settings, I mean in regulatory agencies have models of risk themselves, with those seen within, for example, patient groups, and where these overlap and where they don't, and whether the latter divergence actually matters. And if it does matter, how can that be understood and help inform governance and oversight of those technologies in use? So doing those sort of modelling would be important. And I think we could also do some comparative analysis of diagnostic methodologies in different contexts: health, environment, and education, for example. There are a whole range of different types of diagnostic methodologies and tests in those settings. And they're formalised in things like health technology assessment for health, environment agencies, and educational agencies. And we could see whether the concerns we have, the complexity of health, map onto these other areas, the environment and education. If they don't, why don't they? If they do, what happens in those other settings? And are people resolving that in other settings outside of health? I suspect they do overlap, and I suspect they deal with it in rather different ways. And finally, there is a move in the government in the UK to, you might have heard of this, What Works centres. Have you heard of the What Works centres? So the ministries in the UK are now developing What Works centres, and this is a move that responds to the lessons of evidence-based X, whatever it is, medicine, education, and so on. Where, as Chris said right at the beginning, evidence-based medicine is not about giving the answers, it's pointing at the uncertainties. And so in light of that, through agencies like Nesta, and key players with some policy roots, such as Jeff Mulgan, there's been a gradual embrace by the British government towards, sorry, I should say the English government, towards What Works centres. And this is a shift towards a pragmatic form of evidence. And this is a very different type of non-modernist approach to evidence that's now being adopted in government circles. And so there may be a healthy dose of pragmatism coming through that route, which could possibly lead to changing the way in which developments being devices, tests and regulators might work out in the future. And then the final point, does diagnosis actually mean anything? Sarah's final point, we should hang on to that, because it's crucial, like I've said.
Thank you.